Hey everyone, welcome back to Dev Parkour. I'm Brian Parks. On Monday, I talked about static analysis, static security testing, and we showed how to use SonarQube to scan your code. And we scanned both the Glassminnow project and the very first PHP project that I ever did, which you can also find online. But next week we're going to talk about dynamic security testing, which as I mentioned on Monday, is when we actually run the application and do security testing against a running instance of the application. In the case of a web application, basically we run through a few happy path URLs and then kind of tweak the URLs, tweak the requests, and see what the responses come back as, and see if they are indicative of any particular type of vulnerability. And while we'll get into the specific vulnerabilities next week after I show you how to actually run one of these security testing tools against your code, today I wanted to talk in a little bit more depth about what that process actually looks like. So as I mentioned, there's a set of happy path requests and responses, and then a set of kind of fuzzed is the new buzzword, fuzzed requests and responses. So what does that actually look like? So to start off with, typically these tools ask you to point them at the root of your site, and B, they ask you to kind of walk through the login process. And while you're walking through the login process, they're doing some recording. So basically, it's along the lines of, what field do you type your username into? What field do you type your password into? Do you then click a button? Or in some cases, you might be doing like an OAuth authentication. And in those cases, there's a different way to set things up. But in our case, we are logging in directly to the application in the case of Glassminnow. So that's actually the technique that I'll show in Monday's video again. So those are kind of the two prerequisites that you absolutely have to do in order to get any sort of valid pen testing results. In addition to that, you can provide, I forget exactly what the different tools call it, but it's basically like you sit at the application and use the application like you normally would. Maybe if you have a set of manual QA tests, you might run through some of them just to give the tool a little bit more knowledge of where all the different places are in the application that it should definitely focus on. Once you do that, it goes through a process of crawling and discovering. So even if you haven't gone to a specific URL, these tools will probably find it, as long as there's a link to it, or you can actually get to it when you click a submit button somewhere, that sort of thing. So that's the next step that it does. So first, you do a little bit of configuration. Second, you do some exploratory testing. Third, it does some crawling and discovery of your application. And then it starts actually running some tests against those URLs. And what that looks like is it will change the cookies that it sends. It'll change the query string parameters. In some cases, it'll add query string parameters that weren't part of your URL. It'll just add, basically garbage and see how the application responds. If there's a form submission, it'll try adding different things to the form fields, bad data or new fields, or something along those lines, to try to get something different to happen, to really try to find those edge cases. An example might be, if it detects that you have a number field on your form, it might try to send a string create a raw HTTP request and send a string as part of the post body in place of the number, and see what happens. See how your application responds. Does it dump out a stack trace, in which case that means one thing. Does it reflect that right back to the user, which that means another thing. It will try to inject scripts into your code, and it'll actually do two types of detection on those scripts. One is if it submits a form with script right in a one of those form fields, and the script executes, or it detects that the script would execute. It doesn't actually run this in a browser, again, for security reasons. Then that means that you have one type of cross-site scripting. If, however, it makes another request where it wasn't trying to test for cross-site scripting and still sees that a script in the page would execute, that was something it inserted from a previous test, that means it's stored cross-site scripting. It's a different type of cross-site scripting. So these tools can really target specifically different vulnerabilities, and it runs a ton of requests. So you'll see, I don't know exactly how long the scan will take, but if I can, I will try to just leave it running the entire time on camera, and maybe do some commentary as I notice what URLs it's scanning and maybe what it's trying to do. So it should be interesting. I'm excited for Monday's video, if you can't tell. I'm really excited for Monday's video. I think these tools are absolutely amazing. Really smart people have built them, and they do a really great job at identifying some, honestly, they make developers uncomfortable. They have made me uncomfortable before. I look at them and I see, oh yeah, this is probably something we should change. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's something that's easy to change. Sometimes these changes mean significant architectural lifts, depending on especially how your front end was built. And I'll get into describing a little bit more of that as we get into both looking at the results of the pen test and talking about some of the, some of what it means and what it means I'm going to do to Glassminnow. Because again, this is why I'm doing this penetration test. Yes, I can look at the code and see that there are things that I want to change that I think could be better, but realistically, I want to go after the most impactful areas, either the lowest hanging fruit or the things that are going to be the biggest deal for someone else. If someone else wants to use Glassminnow and one of their criteria is that it must have no high or critical vulnerabilities on a penetration test, well, I better have run a penetration test on it so that I know that I'm not going to come back with any high or critical vulnerabilities. Again, there are some details. I think I already mentioned I'm going to be running this on my local machine, so I'm not going to be running it with SSL on HTTPS. So that'll probably get flagged. Hopefully that doesn't unduly taint the results. We'll see. But yeah, that's the general overview of what dynamic security testing does and what it is. And I should note that even on some of the initial exploratory requests that it sends, it may still find security vulnerabilities. It may find, that you put in some, something in a form field, and it came back, and that kind of matches a specific pattern, or other higher level things. So things like your cookies not being, HTTP only or secure only or something like that. Again, my cookies are not going to be secure only because I'm not running on HTTPS. But those sorts of things, those sorts of things are going to get flagged. Yeah. So in future videos, we'll talk about things like what the results of the pen test actually mean, what I'm actually going to do to fix some of them in Glassminnow, and when and why to do a security test. That's kind of important. That's one of the things that I've had a lot of conversations around. People a lot of times want to jump into running a security test. But security tests are very involved, and if you're not doing them yourself, they can be very expensive. Actually, one of the tools that I'll be showing is an extremely expensive tool. I'll be using just a free trial of it that I haven't even signed up for because that's how expensive it is. So super expensive. It can be really expensive to run these tests, but really worthwhile, absolutely worthwhile. However, it's not something you want to just be running, all the time necessarily. My cat is getting into a bunch of boxes, so I'm gonna go see into that. Hope you enjoyed this video. Go ahead and hit that thumbs up button if you did. Subscribe and click that notification bell so you'll get notified when the next few videos get released and on into the future. I really enjoy having you along for the ride, and I hope you're learning something as well. With that, I'm going to sign off, and I will see you tomorrow.